The northeast coast of the US has been plunged into a cloud of hazy gray smoke, originating from serious and tragic wildfires in Canada. In New York City, where millions of people live and many are at major health risk, the quality of the air reached its worst since the 1980s at least, and it's even worse than after 9/11, and it's made it look like a scene from Blade Runner. Further, for many, including myself, this is the first time seeing something like this firsthand. Professional sports games have been canceled, flights have been grounded, and much more. And yet, being here on the East Coast, nothing felt like it really changed. Now, there's a good chance you've already heard and known all of this, but it's like, how else do I really start this video, Like, I don't know. Am I bad at this? Probably. And the West Coast of America is probably looking over here at us East Coasters, and they're probably laughing. But in reality, it's definitely like that meme where it's the guy and he's holding up a mask of smiles, but on the inside he's really crying. So don't make fun of us, you West Coast people. Anyways, as I already briefly mentioned, being here on the hustly and bustly East Coast, please don't dox me, you would have noticed very minimal change to the daily going on. For multiple days, the news and our weather apps let us know that the quality of the air was hazardous and unhealthy at times, which really it's like, what's the big difference, Still, all there were warnings from public officials and media agencies. There was no sort of official action taken. And what followed was normal automatic churnings of this society. People were still going to work, doing their shopping, going to school, and so on. Some people wore masks, but they were only a tiny fraction, while others were driving around with their windows down, acting like it was just a nice, sunny summer day. Meanwhile, it was right in front of our faces. I mean, just like a few dozen yards away, you could see houses, trees, buildings, whatever, shrouded in a cloudy haze that looks like the opening to a B-class Halloween movie. Here, there are numerous similarities to the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown. While this situation was less threatening than the pandemic, it was still not something to be taken lightly. And I think some really intriguing conclusions, politically and philosophically, can be drawn up from the East Coast smoke. One of the best examples of willful blindness you could find is that of Troy Maxon, the main character in August Wilson's Fences, taking place pre-civil rights movement. Troy has many flaws, like being unfaithful to his wife Rosa and mistreating his best friend Bono. Because I think this was before Bono from YouTube. It's fair to say that Troy has arrived at this stage of his life mainly because of his fall from grace. You see, Troy used to be a star in the African American Baseball League, but he was unable to cross the racial barrier into Major League Baseball, still dominated by white men at the time. Anyone on the outside knows this is not Troy's fault, and yet he can only really blame himself. And as the play goes on, it reveals that Troy is really this sulky and bitter man. Meanwhile, he has his son Corey, who is a fantastic football player, and he has colleges seeking his arrival on campus to play football for them, a fantastic feat of the day. However, Troy is having none of this, as he's traumatized by what happened in his earlier life, and he attempts to force his son to work a low-end job instead, as he's convinced that the role of African American men in the country is just that. But what he's unaware of, or at least chooses not to recognize, is that he's become the first colored man to be a garbage truck driver in the city of Pittsburgh, breaking racial barriers. Further, he chooses not to aware that his son's recruitment is also fantastic progress. He's fundamentally, willfully blind. Ultimately, this leaves Troy in a place of despair, as he's now estranged from his family essentially, and we see, following his death, that his family has to sort of work up the courage to forgive him of his sins, as they're largely undeserved to be forgiven. So why do I bring up willful blindness? Why do I tell the tale of Troy Maxon? Just like with the pandemic, This wildfire smoke situation represents it perfectly. People are refusing to look facts in the face as they want to continue on with normal life. And I don't blame them for that inherently. This time around, like I said before, it wasn't as seriously, and claims of unethical behavior would be harder to make, as it was mainly people's choices to affect themselves versus going out and affecting someone else. Although I did see while driving past a nursing home that there were some residents, just chilling outside, and if anything does happen to them, it would be their fault. So many similarities. People don't like change, especially if it means that they can't keep on doing what they want to do. On the other hand though, decisions and freedoms always and must come with trade-offs. I think this aspect of decisions and freedoms goes largely unnoticed, and who knows, maybe it's a part of willful blindness itself. Further though, there's a part of the world in which we live that creates a unwillful blindness. A survey consisting of 2,000 people found that 40% of them just can't stop working. Even scarier, 1 in 6 people reported that they spend 11 hours spending time thinking about work while they're outside of the office. And keep in mind, this is in England, where they at least have, sort of federally enforced paid vacations and holidays, where here in America, we do not have. The point is, capitalism reinforces a bit of psychological conditioning on a society, whereby people think that they have to keep on working unless they'll die. At this point, it's so ingrained into our culture that it makes us unable to stop and think about these sort of massive situations like this recent event. For some, especially during the pandemic, essential workers, if they called off of work out of concern for their safety or their loved one's safety, they would have, or maybe even still do, put their entire livelihood at risk, and therefore put their entire life at risk. Meanwhile, the uber wealthy are creating more and more generational wealth, more and more capital. It does feel as if the pandemic, sort of accelerated capitalism in a way that was inconceivable before the pandemic happened. Ultimately, the snowball that is capitalism going downhill at immense speed affects us in insurmountable ways that are really deeper than we can even really begin to imagine, I think. And it also creates a situation where we can't imagine life or society looking any other possible way. Additionally, another key aspect to willful blindness, or maybe unwillful blindness, which I'll get to in just a tad, is pertaining to climate change. These Canadian wildfires are some of the worst in recent recorded history, and as we've seen all too frequently, natural disasters are getting way too, disastrous, and they're happening way too often. I do wonder if people are in a sort of denial about what's to come with climate change. I mean, after all, we are teetering on the edge of, this irreversible course. It's well known that we have only 1.5 degrees Celsius, rise in global temperature left before the effects become pretty bad. And so, while I understand that that's a lot on a global climate scale, it's still really not that much at all. That's not a whole lot of wiggle room, no matter how you look at it. And so, the unwillful, blind people. These people have been lied to, mainly by conservative media, that things like these, climate change, how bad the pandemic really was, aren't even really a real thing, that they have nothing to be worried about. And it's to the point where they're confronted with the reality of climate change, with the reality of the pandemic, and yet they still choose to ignore it. Therefore, they do become willfully blind. Circular stuff. I feel as if I could go on and on about willful blindness and, how climate change and capitalism entangle and really hurt us so badly. But I feel as if the main fundamental point here is that all of these things take away and deteriorate our humanity. Again, I have to stress this. Just because one human being is concerned with their own safety and other people's safety, another human being will inherently make the other human being's life worse, all because of money, this fake thing. And this, I think, is a telltale sign of us losing the plot. And I'm definitely not an expert on ethics, but what is realized here in this East Coast smoke is that when situations like these happen, retrospection almost has no place at all. Peace and love.